Hey everyone, this is Jeff again. So we're going to get started. Thanks for everyone for joining us. For those of you who just joined, I'm Jeff Desmarais. I'm a Senior Project Manager here at the Institute for Community Health.
And I'm Ranjani, the Assistant Director of Evaluation.
And so today's webinar is going to focus on how to create and use an organizational logic model for strategic planning and performance assessment. Sorry. What do next slide? Sorry guys, having a quick technical difficulty. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. All right. So today we're going to provide an overview of what logic models are, starting at the program level, and then we're going to expand to the organizational level. We'll then discuss how to use a logic model for strategic planning, as well as for program evaluation, and then we're going to end the presentation by talking briefly about some logic modeling tools that we'll definitely send to you after the webinar through your email addresses. And again, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to use the chat function. We're monitoring that, and we'll try our best to address them. And if you have any additional questions by the end, feel free to reach out to us directly. So I'll give you a brief moment to read these. These are just the training objectives that are largely reflected in the outline, which I just reviewed. Great. So before we begin, we want to introduce our organization briefly. So we're at the Institute for Community Health, or ICH. So ICH is a nonprofit consulting organization, and we work with health centers, nonprofits, foundations, and government agencies to improve services and maximize impact. And the way that we do that is by offering participatory evaluation, applied research, assessment and planning, and data services. And throughout our work, we've often, both as an organization and individuals, for Ranjani and I, have used program and organizational logic models with our partners to great success. So we thought that it would be a good kind of training to share with people in the field today. So I'm going to start with what a logic model is. So a logic model at its very core is a visual representation of the relationship between a program's activities and its outcomes. So what is done and what you expect to happen. So a logic model should be able to be read in two directions. If you start with the activity, you should be able to see if I do an activity, then something will change. And if you start with an outcome or change, you should be able to ask, but how did that happen? Again, you can really think about a logic model. You can really use logic model for anything that has a cause and effect. So just say that you have a headache and you want it to go away. Your activity is that you get pills and that you take pills. And then your outcome is that you expect, what you expect to happen is that you feel better. So just say you're trying to create a logic model for something a little bit more sophisticated than an everyday headache, although those can definitely be hard to get rid of sometimes. You would want to try to include some of these particular components. So most agencies are more familiar with a programmatic version of the logic model, so we really want to start there and then kind of build out to the organizational logic model. So there's basically three components when you create a program logic model. You have the program, the outcomes, and the impact. A program is made up of two subcomponents, activities and participation. So activities are what we do. So they could be you conduct workshops, you deliver services, you generate resources, you conduct trainings, you provide referrals, provide healthcare, you advocate, you partner with agencies, and participation is who you reach. So it could be participants, it could be clients, it could be collaborators. If you are focusing on policy change, it could be decision makers or policy makers, could be customers or consumers. And for outcomes again are what you are expecting your program to achieve. There really should be a flow of outcomes that first begins with short-term outcomes, medium-term, which then leads to long-term and ultimately impact. The types of early changes you would probably see are things like knowledge, skills, attitudes, perceptions, motivations, opinions. those generally tend to lead to changes in what people are doing, so actions, behaviors, practices, decision-making, policies, and then the changes in behaviors, changes in policies, changes in things that are being done, then ultimately leads to the long-term outcomes, which are ideally changes in health status, social conditions, environmental conditions, economic conditions, and ultimately that leads to the impact, which is a pretty broad, almost vision-y way of describing what you're trying to achieve, and it's often articulated at a kind of community, society, or population level change. So when you're actually starting to work on your logic model, especially with the program logic model, you really should try to really intentionally write out your activities. So think about what you're doing and who you're doing it with. So programs could be running parenting groups, coalition meetings, distributing mailings, or even providing grants. And again, participation is who you're targeting, who you're doing it with. The participants could be demographically specific, or they could be broader categories. So they could be, for example, could be teens aged 14 to 18 living in Boston, or it could be a very broad category such as new immigrants. And when you are describing your program, really try to answer the following questions. What are the specific activities that make up the program? What needs to be done to run my program? And who is the program meant to reach? Great. And so for outcomes again are really the changes that you expect to see as a result of the program. Some example outcomes could be knowledge, so increase in knowledge of child development topics depending on what you're evaluating. Attitudes, so more accepting attitudes towards people with mental health conditions. So if you're thinking about stigma towards mental health conditions, that might be an outcome you might want to look at. Behaviors, increases in fresh fruit and vegetable consumption. Health outcome, decrease in rate of heart disease. Social condition could be much more broad, could be a very relevant outcome depending on your program. A reduction in chronic homelessness in Massachusetts. So again, Massachusetts is the community population, and chronic homelessness are the part of that community you're trying to affect. And economic conditions, so increase in average household income among community of color. So these are just some very broad types of outcomes, but they are fairly often used in logic models. All right, so now that I've kind of went through the basics of what a program logic model is and what goes into it, I want to read a scenario that we have made up. So I'll give everyone about a minute to read through this, and then I'll read it as well. And then we'll actually start going into a kind of example logic model we made based upon this scenario, so you can think about how we start to go and create logic models. All right, great. I think everyone's been able to read it, but I can go through it very briefly as well. So in the community of Eddytown, many children struggle socially, emotionally, and cognitively when they start school. In 2005, a group of community members and parents came together to start holding informal workshops to teach parenting skills to support healthy child development. This group received funding and created a nonprofit organization called the Family Support Center. Through the Family Support Center's workshops, they learned that low-income parents in Eddytown often needed the most support. They formalized their program into a 6-week program on parenting and child development topics. They then taught child development concepts and positive parenting strategies. They asked parents to practice. They also asked parents to practice the skills at home. And the hope was that this would then lead to children having more nurturing environments and improved relationships with their parents, and that this would then lead to more children meeting expected milestones and displaying healthy socio-emotional skills. There we go. So this is a logic model that we created. Again, kind of read through it on your own, and we can definitely discuss it a little bit. But just to kind of orient you, over here on the left-hand side, we have activities. So activities, what goes into running the parenting education program we just described. They advertise the program and recruit parents. That's very kind of key component. It's not part of the curriculum, but it's a part of what they actually have to do to deliver the workshops. They also refine the curriculum based upon program feedback and new research. They want to really stay cutting edge and make sure that they're delivering effective programs to parents. So this is another kind of key activity that's thought that they really need to put into their logic models. And then they hold group workshops on parenting and child development topics. And they have 6 sessions or days basically per cycle. So these are the kind of key activities they really wanted to highlight. So as far as the kind of chain of logic that happens, with the short-term outcomes, parents increase in knowledge and understanding of child development and positive parenting strategies. We also see parents increase their confidence in their ability to promote positive child development. So again, we started with short-term outcomes, what changes in people's attitudes or knowledge, or what kind of changes in their minds. And then what happens according to this logic because of that. We then assume that at home parents will frequently apply positive parenting strategies and developmentally appropriate activities, which then would lead to children experiencing a more nurturing, supportive, and engaging environment, and that children would have warmer and more responsive relationships with their parents. You can note here that you can have 2 intermediate term outcomes, you can have 2 short-term outcomes within the same chain of logic, and you could even have some outcomes that kind of fall in between. Really think about what needs to happen for something else to happen, but it might not always be 100% clean into and clearly divisible into these different categories. And so then we also see that more children meet expected physical and cognitive milestones and display healthy social and emotional regulation skills, which then leads to the ultimate impact is that all children in any town are healthy and prepared to succeed in school. So this is our logic model for the kind of program. We also have participation down here, so low-income parents in any town attend and participate in program activities. So now that we have went over the program level logic model, we really want to kind of scale it up to what an organizational level logic model would be. Sorry, 1 second. All right, that's good. Basically, there's kind of 2 big differences when we think about program level and organizational level logic models, the focus and the goal. So the focus for program level logic models is that you're trying to take individual activities and identify them and see how they make up a specific program, whereas the focus for the organizational level logic model is how all programs and services that the organization offers kind of group together at that organizational level. And then for the goal behind creating either one of these, the goal for the program level logic model is to articulate how program activities connect to intended outcomes, whereas for the organizational level, the big goal is really to articulate how various programs connect together to one another and ultimately lead to supporting the organization's mission and vision. So we find organizational logic models to be valuable for a number of reasons. The first is that often agencies are pulled into new projects due to changing community needs, funding sources, staff interests, and donors, and having an organizational logic model can really help agencies make strategic decisions regarding new initiatives or pursuing even new funding. We also notice that in our work that oftentimes multi-service agencies may offer lots of different programs that one participant could enroll in. So for example, someone may be participating in a homework health center, a teen pregnancy prevention program, and a job training class all at the same time. And we do find it to be worthwhile for each program to have their own logic model, but sometimes when you just look at those individual programs, the impacts that all of them have together on that individual can be lost or missed. So we find organizational logic models to kind of help articulate that. Also, sometimes agencies don't always know exactly where synergies across programs could exist, and they also might not know where silos and gaps could be within the agency. So kind of really writing out all the different programs and how they connect could really help better understand that and how to identify areas for collaboration across departments or programs. And they also can streamline program operations and identify efficiencies. So again, if there may be some overlapping programs, and it could be that a participant is taking essentially 4 different versions of an intake form, that it might be possible to kind of streamline into one universal form. So that could just, 1, reduce the number of surveys that participant is taking, and 2, reduce the number of paperwork that the program staff within the organization have to fill out and use. And also, if an agency hopes to achieve an outcome, but they aren't directly working to address it, then they can by really kind of thinking about what the individual programs are doing, it can really help figure out whether there's one particular program that can help work on addressing that outcome, or see if a brand new program needs to develop to address that outcome. And then finally, oftentimes agencies have to create strategic plans, and logic models can really visualize kind of current approaches and goals, as well as kind of lay out future purposes and goals and programs. All right, so this is the organizational level logic model. So as you'll see here, the org logic model is very similar to the program logic model, only it's broader, and it does have a couple other items. So here on the left, I believe everyone's left, we have organization, and under organization we have programs or services. So what does the organization offer? Participation, that is somewhat similar for the program level logic model. So who is being reached with each program or service? So there will still be participants, clients, collaborators, decision makers, customers, consumers. However, they may be at a much higher level. You may want to kind of group different categories together. So it's possible that an agency is serving different groups of youth, as well as different groups of parents, but maybe for the organizational level logic model, you really want to have youth and parents be kind of their own buckets as opposed to individual groups of each. You also see that on the left-hand side, we have values, so what the organization believes in. Oftentimes, organizations may have like value statements, and I think that having the values kind of over here really shows what the organization believes in and how those values really inform the rest of the logic model and their work. Over here we have outcomes. They're all really similar to the previous outcomes we discussed, but again, they would be at a much higher level. And then we have above and to the right, we have the mission statement. So many agencies have mission statements, so it's good to kind of include that, and this kind of summarizes what the organization's purpose is and what they're doing to move towards the vision. And as opposed to impact, in the program level logic model, for the org logic model, we have vision. So that's truly the aspirational future state that your organization is trying to work towards. All right, so the organizational logic model has kind of 2 big elements like I just talked about, so I won't go into it too much in detail. So the organization, what you're collectively doing, and the outcomes, the changes you expect to see. The only thing I want to note is that for programs, you may want to collapse different kinds of programs and departments and initiatives depending on the kind of scale of your agency. So that's really going to be up to the particular agency that's working on that, but really kind of think about what the types of activities are being done, how do you bucket them together into broader categories, and then what are those broader programs achieving in the outcomes. For vision, again, vision is the future aspirational state the organization is trying to achieve. It's very similar to impact in program level logic model, and all outcomes really should lead to the vision. Mission is very similar to a mission statement, so it really should summarize concisely what the agency's purpose is and what they're trying to do to move towards the vision, oftentimes people will try to include some vision language into the mission, but the mission really should be focusing on what you're doing. And again, values are what the org believes in, and it really guides how you do your work. So now we're going to return to the Family Support Center. So we have another scenario here. I'll give everyone a moment to read it, and then I'll kind of walk through it, highlight some important components, and then show you organizational logic model for the Family Support Center. All right, so I'm going to read this out now that everyone has had a chance to review it on their own. So the Family Support Center, since we last visited them, a lot has been going on. They have run many successful groups. However, they realized that beyond teaching parenting skills, the families needed case management and referral to services to support them in other parts of their lives, such as SNAP benefits or housing support. Those are both nutrition, food, and housing are really kind of critical for family and child health and development. And so they really tried to address that in their work. And they also started a playgroup program to help kids build social skills and create connections among parents. Though their programs were well attended, they did also know that teen parents were not participating, even though they often needed the most support. So in recognizing that teen parents had very different needs from adult parents, they decided to create a program targeted for teen parents. And so as they started to expand this programming, the Family Support Center needed to better articulate to their board and funders how their various programs connected to support their vision of a community in which all children and families are healthy and thriving. And so they decided to make this particular organizational logic model to help them do that. So this is somewhat tiny text, I would imagine, for everyone, depending on your screen size. We are going to send this PDF as a handout to everyone after the workshop, so you can kind of look at it. But I will let everyone look at it on their own for a few moments. But just some things to kind of note here is that up top here, we have the mission of the Family Support Center. On the left-hand side, we have the values, working in partnership with families, being responsive to each family's needs, treating clients with compassion and respect, addressing social determinants of health, and continuously improving programs and services. We still have participation down here, and then we have their vision statement on the right-hand side. You'll see here that we have color-coded the boxes. Oftentimes, color coding can help you demonstrate visually, both for yourselves as well as external partners that are looking at this, what the different, how different outcomes and programs connect with one another. So up top here, we still have the parenting education groups and programs that we initially reviewed in the program level logic model that kind of go through all the logic here. So those are all the same, but you'll also see that the play groups that I just described are also helping achieve those goals. And then also we have the Teen Parent Support Program. Those are also helping achieve these sort of goals. So this is just to say that there's lots of different types of ways of visualizing the logic. It may be linear. You may need to kind of go back to a previous box. So for example, down here, we see that teen parents have increased knowledge of safe sex. Other kind of knowledge is increased. That leads to teen parents using contraception more, which leads to fewer unwanted additional pregnancies. And that then leads to two other intermediate outcomes where more teen parents graduate from high school and more teen parents go to college and or enter careers that allow them to financially support their families. But by having more teen parents graduate from high school, that also does help support the outcome of more teen parents going to college or entering careers that allow them to financially support their families. So this is all just to say that even though it's called a logic model and it's supposed to be linear in a lot of ways, you do have options to try to make it non-linear in other ways if you really need to, and it really should reflect the work that your agency is doing. All right, so now, and again, I'll send that out to everyone at the very end, both a PDF of it and all of these slides. So when you actually want to try to create a logic model with stakeholders, here's a couple of tips and tricks. So the logic modeling process in itself is valuable and can often lead to new insights and ideas. Oftentimes people don't always, they're carrying out their programs and they're working in their department, but they may not necessarily always see how their program specifically contributes to the larger agency goals and efforts. They know it in a very intuitive sense. They see it every day, but they don't necessarily they're not able to put that on paper. So oftentimes logic modeling can really help lead to new insights and new ideas and help people better understand how their work connects to the agency. Also, logic modeling with a group creates a shared understanding and common basis for future planning and decision making. So oftentimes agencies will have to do strategic planning, and by doing a kind of group logic model, you can really use that logic model, and if there may be a new program that needs to be created, or a new direction that needs to be taken, or a new evaluation tool that needs to be developed to measure a different outcome, logic modeling can really kind of build that buy-in kind of at the start, because everyone has input into the logic model who works on it. Also, when you're working on the logic model with stakeholders, make sure that you include people that have experience with the individual programs, so program level staff, as well as people who have a bird's eye view of the organization. That could be the executive director, that could be a program manager, because they both have unique and important perspectives to include. And also, if you're really just kind of starting out from scratch, sometimes it can be helpful just to start with the vision, mission, and value statement if your agency doesn't already have that, because some of the key components that go into those are match on very well to creating an organizational logic model. And so now here's some tips for logic modeling with stakeholders. Often handouts can be very helpful to lay out terminology and prompt brainstorming. We have some handout examples that we'll send you all after this webinar that you can use, just so everyone can kind of read it as they're discussing or working on it. Also, when you're doing a logic model, if you're going to facilitate it, you might want to, and you're thinking about program activities and outcomes, you may want to start and say, everyone write down the activities that you can think about and have them write down on a sticky note, and then they can put all their sticky notes for programs in one part of the board that you're working on or on the table, and then same thing for outcomes. And using the sticky notes lets people kind of move them around and have to be a little bit more interactive. So we found that to be pretty helpful. And oftentimes it's easier to do initial brainstorming with more people and work through all the details and wordsmithing and refinement at a little bit of a later on stage. And so when you're facilitating a logic model, and we have kind of other questions in one of the handouts as well, here's some kind of good, helpful questions that you can use. So for programs, what are the core things that this agency or organization offers? And if you need to categorize or group programs, do any of these programs or services have commonalities in how they operate or the topics they focus on that can help with the categorization process? For outcomes, if you want to work right to left in the logic model, so from impact to activities, in 10 years, if everything is going well, what would that look like? What would have changed in our community? And what needs to change before that to make this happen, to make that change happen? And then if you want to work from left to right, so you start with the program first, you would ask them what will happen as a result of each program and what changes do you expect in the first 6 months for people who are involved? And if those changes happen, what will happen after that? So often when I do logic models, depending on the program, I may start right to left or left to right, but I'll always make sure at some point that I flip the direction as well to make sure that it makes sense in the other direction too.
Great. So at this point, I'm going to take over, and we're going to now switch from talking about what a logic model is and what goes in it, and now talk about the ways in which you can actually put your model to use for things like decision-making at your organization, strategic planning, evaluation planning. So I think in our experience, and in probably your experience for some of you that have made logic models before, they're often created to meet a requirement. This happens a lot for grant proposals, or sometimes during a grant you have to make one. But then it's also really common for that model, once it's created, to never actually be taken out again or used as a kind of active tool. And we really believe that logic models can be really valuable, but to get the most out of it, you have to make it something that's more of a living document that is brought out, looked at, and updated regularly, especially to reflect the fact that organizations do evolve over time. So just some suggestions for how, once you've kind of gone through the work of creating your organizational logic model, how you might think about making sure it's used. You could set aside an annual review time, maybe as part of yearly work planning or other planning that your organization might be doing, to take that out, revisit it, update it if the organization has changed in any way. If you are developing a new grant proposal or in the process of coming up with a new program or service, that would be a great time to take out the model and use it as a tool to think about how well your new idea is aligning with the sort of framework of your organization. And then strategic planning is a great opportunity also to use the logic model, both to think about opportunities that you might find from the model as it is, but also, start using it to think about, well, what should the organization look like moving forward? So I'll just note before moving forward, the logic model itself is not going to give you answers or tell you what to do, but I think really where it becomes useful is as a launch pad for discussion, by kind of sitting with some stakeholders and really looking at it critically and reflecting. There are some key points of discussion that can help you identify maybe issues that you need to think about resolving, but also help you identify some areas of opportunity. So we would just generally recommend that if you are using your logic model, involving multiple people, similarly to creating a logic model, involving stakeholders or decision makers, because everyone's going to see it with a slightly different perspective, and that can sometimes bring forward new ideas. So what I'm going to go through in the next piece is 4 critical questions, and these are questions that you can use to kind of kick off some discussion with your logic model in hand. So each organization is different. Every logic model is going to look a little different. As Jeff noted, you may make your own decisions about how to format or lay it out. But, there's not going to be a formula for how your discussion will unfold. But these questions are a great place to start, just to kind of launch some discussion that can help you then move forward into some decision making. So what I'm going to do is talk through each of these questions. I'll give some examples and just some points to consider when you're, facilitating a discussion around these questions. So the first point is to look at your logic model and really critically think about how well your various programs are connecting up to your organization's vision. So you can do this. You want to look at it from left to right, see are there strong connections when you take each program and kind of walk out how it gets to the vision, but also looking right to left. So examining your vision and saying, is every piece of this being addressed through our programming? So really at the end of the day, even if you have a big organization with many programs, you want them all to be working towards that ultimate vision at the end. So the logic model, may or may not be showing that clearly. So it's an opportunity to think about what that means for your organization. And I'll say this question in particular is really helpful to take a look at when organizations have changed or evolved. Oftentimes this has happened even with our own, with ICH, our own consulting organization, that things change. You sort of evolve into offering a new service or maybe add a program, and just taking the opportunity to stop and think about how that all connects back together and where are we going as an organization is really helpful. So in examining this question, you might identify that there is a program where you're feeling like the connection to the vision is not that clear or maybe not as strong as you want it to be. So if that happens, there's a couple ways to think about it. You might consider whether the organization has evolved in a new direction. Maybe the vision of the organization and the mission that goes with it need to be updated or changed. And then the kind of flip side of that is maybe the program itself needs to be someone needs to go back and think about that and think about whether there's a way to make it better align with the vision of the organization as is. But generally, if you are seeing a program that doesn't feel strongly connected to your organization's vision, that's an indicator that there's some sort of mission drift that's happened at some point, and that can be okay. Organizations do evolve and change, but it's sort of a flag to say, is this a good direction for us, and should we intentionally move that way, or do we need to kind of redirect a little bit? And then thinking more about the right to left way to look at this, looking at your vision statement, you want to ask yourself if all kind of components of that vision statement are being addressed through the programs or services that you're offering. So vision statements are aspirational. They sometimes can be quite broad in what they're covering, but ideally what you're saying in your vision is somehow you're touching upon it in your various programs. So here, if you feel like there's a piece of your vision that you're not yet kind of working on through your programs, that might mean that maybe the statement is actually too broad and you need to just refine it a little bit. Or maybe this is an opportunity to identify whether there's some new program or service that you could create that would help fill in that gap. So here I'm going to turn back to the example of the Family Support Center. And in this example, in thinking about this question about how well the programs connect to the vision, the organization felt that actually their 4 programs with the 4 different colors actually all did connect well. They felt like the logic modeling helped them actually articulate and visualize the fact that they all at the end moved towards that final vision that their organization wanted to address. So the model itself became a tool then for going to the board or other stakeholders and explaining how things connect. When they might seem, at first glance to be 4 sort of disparate programs, they were able to use the model to show the way that they are all aligned with the organization's mission and vision. They also did stop, though, to think about their vision statement, a community in which all children and families are healthy and thriving, and really dig into what that means. And this prompted sort of some discussion about what does all children and families mean? Is it time for us to sort of step back and think about who we're trying to reach in our community? Do we need to look back at who is most in need of our services, and has that shifted over time? So it can be as simple as, a single word in the vision statement that you want to dig into and see, what that means for you and whether you feel like your organization is addressing it appropriately. So the second question is to think about how much outcomes overlap across the different programs that you're offering. So this is really looking at, if you have multiple programs, are they connecting to the vision through different pathways or mostly the same pathway? And either of those could be okay. It's just a matter of thinking about what that means for your organization. So if you do see a lot of overlaps in the outcomes, this says that you have multiple programs that are all trying to create similar short-term and intermediate-term changes. So now the question is, taking a look at how those programs are working together or not together, depending how things are being run. So you can ask yourself, are the programs operating more in silos? Or are they actually coordinated and working synergistically? Are there opportunities here? Are there clients who are maybe enrolled in multiple programs? If so, can you coordinate them better so that client maybe could have an amplified outcome? Excuse me. And are there other opportunities maybe to streamline processes across programs, maybe even combine or collapse programs, given that they're trying to achieve the same thing? So is there a way to make things better connected so that those outcomes are maximized? Now, if you don't see a lot of overlaps in your kind of streams of outcomes, so this says that the programs have different mechanisms for getting to the vision, which can be totally fine and effective. But the question is just to take a look at that and ask, is this an indication that the organization is spread too thin, or are all of these different outcome paths seeming to work out pretty well? So this does lead into some evaluation questions in terms of, taking the time to think about, we have these many different outcomes we're trying to achieve in a few different pathways. Are they actually happening? If they're happening, then maybe that model works really well. If you're finding that maybe one set of outcomes isn't happening as much as others, then that could be an opportunity to think about restructuring. So back to the Family Support Center for this example. Here, what the organization recognized is that when they looked at the blue and the green programs, so that's the parenting education workshops and then the playgroup program, they noted that the blue and the green overlapped in almost every outcome. So both of these programs were really trying to do the same thing through the same pathway. So this made them think about how things were actually working, and they recognized that although the programs were really trying to get to the same thing, they were operating as independent programs. So people were, participants were signing up for these programs separately. They weren't really thinking about how they were connected. They were really just two separate programs that happened to be seeking to achieve the same outcomes. So this prompted them to think about whether they could coordinate things better and make things more efficient for families that were enrolled in both. And eventually they decided actually to collapse the two and integrate the playgroups into the parenting education workshop program, with the hopes of, they were thinking that if now they were more intentionally offering both things to their participants, they could achieve, maybe a greater extent of the outcomes that they wanted. So the third question to consider is, how realistic is the progression from short-term to long-term outcomes? So this is walking through your outcomes from left to right and thinking, kind of looking at each arrow and saying, is it realistic to expect that this is going to, one thing is going to lead to the next? Here, you really want to think about assumptions. Oftentimes, hidden kind of in the arrow of a logic model, there are underlying assumptions about, for example, a condition that has to be in place in order for the short-term thing to lead to the intermediate thing. So stopping to think about that, maybe, noting it down on your model or making that assumption more explicit can be really helpful. And it can also help you think about if there's anything you can do through your programs or services to make it more likely that the short term leads to intermediate term, leads to long term. Or there's maybe opportunities to add something, modify something to help that progression be more realistic. So with the example we have here, one of their long-term outcomes in the sort of middle on the right of the long-term outcomes was parents are more resilient in the face of stress and have improved mental health. So the way that they thought they could get there was through their programs that were promoting sort of networking and social connection among parents. They knew that social isolation is related to mental health, so their logic was that we are facilitating social connection, so we think that will help with mental health. They also thought that their case management that they were offering by helping families access services that they need would relieve stress, make sure people have their basic needs met, and then lead to improved mental health as a result. However, while they felt that those things still were logical, they did recognize that mental health is a complex issue, and they couldn't necessarily expect to always impact it just through the services that they're offering. So they wanted to see if they could offer something a little bit more robust to support this idea of eventually helping with parents' mental health. So one idea was to start building some new partnerships with clinical behavioral health service providers so that their case management could not only link to social service agencies, but also do some supported linkage and referral to clinical services for parents who were in need of that. And then the other thing they thought about in terms of making it more likely that the outcomes would go from left to right, kind of move along with the social connection piece, is they realized that yes, they were facilitating social connections through their workshops and their play groups, but, was it really realistic to think that parents would continue on with those connections after the program was over? So they thought one thing they could do there was start adding some social events for people who have graduated or kind of finished up with their programs to just help continue to promote those connections over time. So those are just a couple places where by looking at the strength of the connections, they identified ways that they could make that even more likely to occur. So the last question to ask gets down to the organizational values. And this is really looking at the value statements that you have as an organization, and then thinking about how are things run in, on a day-to-day basis, and how do your values play into that. So here, thinking about how well are your organizational practices aligned with the values. Are there things you can do to make the values more kind of integrated into the work that's being done? So with Family Support Center, one value that they examined was the idea of working in partnership with families. So this was something that was incorporated into the value statements, but when they stopped to think about how they were actually developing and running their programs, they realized that there wasn't much input or partnership with families that was actually happening. Families were participants, but not, really partners. So they realized that one goal was to find ways to involve parents and families more in the program planning and improvement through maybe starting with more of like an advisory council role, and then possibly moving into actually hiring some of their program alumni as staff in the future, so that value could basically be more closely embodied in the way they were doing their work. So at this point, I'm going to switch gears for a couple minutes. I'm just going to take a pause right now just to check. I don't think there's been any, no new questions. So what we're going to do now is spend a few minutes talking about how you can use the logic model for evaluation planning. So up until now, it's been focused more on kind of having strategic discussions, thinking about organizational decisions that need to be made. And this section is going to focus now more on when you're ready to measure your performance or evaluate how you're doing, how you can use the logic model to help you plan for that. And this is one of the biggest ways that we use logic models here. They're just a really essential and useful tool for evaluation planning, because when you've gone through the work of making a logic model, you've already articulated the things that you hope will change through your program. So it kind of gives you this great roadmap for what you should consider measuring. Everything that you might want to measure, theoretically, should be represented on that logic model in some way. So there are six steps in the flowchart on the left that I'll talk through. So the first thing, you start with your logic model. And from there, look at the outcomes, the things that you hope will change as a result of your program, and identify which ones you're interested in actually measuring and collecting some data on. One important thing about logic modeling that we always advise, your logic model should include all the outcomes that you think might happen, not just the ones that you want to measure. And you don't have to measure everything that's on a logic model. There are going to be some that are higher priority for you, based on your audience or your funders or the things that would help you most in improving your program. You don't have to measure every single thing that's on there, but you do want to depict all the changes that you think would occur to have a comprehensive picture of how things work. So in choosing outcomes, one really important thing to consider is the time frame that you have for measuring. So for example, if you want to collect some data and be able to report it out in 6 months, then you need to make sure you're choosing outcomes that you think you could actually measure and expect to see happen in that time frame. Once you know which changes you're most interested in having some data on, you just want to make sure you link back, walk it back, and note down which programs or services are connected to those outcomes, because that tells you where your data needs to come from, who needs to be involved, which of the programs are influencing the outcomes that you're hoping to measure. At this point, one thing we would recommend is to stop and take some time to really clearly articulate why you want to measure each outcome. It's really easy to want to measure lots of things because there are many pieces of data that could be really interesting or informative. But at the end of the day, resources are always limited. Evaluation can be more or less complicated depending what you're trying to do. So taking some time to stop and really thinking through how you want to use the data and then prioritizing and focusing your evaluation questions is really helpful. Because again, you don't need to measure everything. and you might want to start with the things that are most important for some key stakeholders, or maybe you need to apply for a grant and there's a certain piece of data that you think would be great to have in your grant proposals, prioritizing based on how you actually want to use the information. Once you know what you want to measure and why you want to measure it, the next step is identifying indicators. So the indicator is where you start to get really specific about what you're trying to measure here. The indicator is what tells you that this change has happened. So with each outcome, you can ask yourself, how would I know if this has or has not happened? And you want to get as specific as possible. And I'll have an example with the Family Support Center in a couple slides just to illustrate what that looks like. But this is starting to really operationalize, taking an outcome, which is generally a sort of higher level sort of statement of change, and then turning it into something that you can actually collect data on. Oops, okay, went the wrong way. Okay. And then once you have your outcomes, your indicators, then the final thing, and this is often, all of these things may happen at the same time. We've laid it out step by step, but they're very interrelated, is thinking about data sources and data collection. So if you have a specific thing you want to measure, you know what kind of sort of information is going to tell you that the change happened. Then it's, so how do you get that information? Where do you collect it from? What tool do you use? Who do you collect it from? And here again is a great time to do a little step back to prioritize and focus. There might be opportunities. For example, if you are going to run a survey to collect some data, maybe that same survey can be used to collect data on 4 different outcomes. Find efficiencies, look for opportunities to use maybe existing data sources, or maximize your use of the same data source so that you don't have to, ask people to do too many different data collection things, or you don't have to ask your staff to, enter too much data. It's just opportunities for efficiency. So I'll give you one example from the Family Support Center, and this is using a table format that we use often when we are doing evaluation planning, basically laying out all those elements that I just talked about side by side in a table. So here the outcome of interest was parents increase knowledge and understanding of child development and positive parenting strategies. This was really core to some of their programs, and it was something that they've always assumed was happening, because they're teaching workshops, they're doing demonstrations through playgroups. They never had systematically collected data to see how much knowledge change they're actually achieving for their parents. They, with the logic model, connected this back to note that it's both the parenting education workshops and the playgroups that influence this outcome. So that meant they want to consider how to collect data from both of those. And in terms of purpose, the Family Support Center actually had multiple purposes, multiple ways they thought this data could be useful to them. But mainly they wanted to inform program improvements and also have a concrete way to talk about their impact to both their own leadership but also funders. So in terms of how they thought they could use this information, they thought they could share it back in staff meetings, use it as a sort of a point of discussion to think about how the program could be improved. They could present it in their annual reporting back to leadership and board. And they could also incorporate the data into their future funding proposals, as well as progress reports out to their funders. So the indicator for this outcome is at least 90% of participants have increases in self-reported knowledge of each core concept taught through these programs. So just a couple points here. Indicators are most useful when they're specific and when they quantify how much change you need to see for it to count, basically. So here they've said they want 90% of their participants to have an increase, and they want increases in each of the core concepts, increase in the knowledge of each core concept that they're teaching. So kind of really breaking down, when you're talking about increased knowledge, what does that mean? Does it count if somebody, learns one thing but doesn't learn all the other things? Does it count if only one person increases but no one else does? There's a lot of questions there to really think through what change means to you. And then finally, the data collection was a pre-post survey. They decided, since this applied to both the workshops and the playgroups, they would have similar surveys for both, except the specific topics they're asking about would vary based on the goals of each of these programs. And then they decided that the survey would be done, the pre-survey was the first day of the program, the post-survey was the last day. They could have chosen to do actually an individual survey maybe for each workshop session, but they decided to do it over the full course of the program instead. So this just illustrates some of the things to think about with data collection. It gets down to a lot of details of who, what, where, when, how you're going to look at the data, all of those types of things. So we're now in the last couple minutes. We're just going to talk through the materials that we'll be emailing out after this. So we will send the slides. We also are recording the webinar, so we can post that recording and give you access to that as well. We have a worksheet that lays out the elements of an organizational logic model that you could use if you're trying to create one. We are going to give you the Family Support Center example in a PDF so you can zoom it in and see it more clearly. We have a tip sheet with a number of tips and tricks for how to go about making an organizational logic model. We have the critical questions laid out in a handout for you. And then finally, an example worksheet with the evaluation planning matrix table that you could use, if you wanted to actually just fill it out with your staff or yourself. So we're happy to take any questions in the last couple minutes, but also feel free really to email anytime if you have follow-up questions. We're happy to get in touch and talk more.